James had been driving for hours, his eyes fixed on the endless stretch of asphalt that lay before him. His sister's wedding was just a few hours away, and he was already running late. He had decided to take the shortcut through the countryside, thinking it would be faster. But now, as he navigated the winding roads and lonely forests, he realized he might have made a mistake. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the trees and fields. James had turned on the radio to keep himself awake, but the static-filled stations only added to the eerie silence that seemed to surround him. He had been driving for what felt like hours, and the thought of being stranded out here at night was enough to make his skin crawl. That's when he saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, her long hair blowing in the wind, and her thumb outstretched. James was hesitant to pick up a hitchhiker, especially one on such a desolate road, but he couldn't leave her stranded out here. He pulled over and motioned for her to get in. "Thanks so much," she said as she climbed into the passenger seat. "My car broke down a few miles back, and I was starting to think I'd be stuck out here all night." "No problem," James said, trying to sound friendly. "Where are you headed?" "Just up the road a bit," she replied. "There's a cemetery up there that I need to visit. It's where my boyfriend is buried." James didn't like the sound of that, but he didn't say anything. He didn't want to offend her or make her uncomfortable. He turned his attention back to the road, and they drove on in silence. As they approached the cemetery, James couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It was an old graveyard, with crooked headstones and crumbling monuments. The sky was now dark, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the whole area. "That's it up ahead," the woman said, pointing to a small plot of land surrounded by a rusted fence. "Just pull in here, and I'll be out of your hair." James parked the car and watched as the woman got out and made her way to the gate. He felt a chill run down his spine as she disappeared into the graveyard, and he was suddenly very aware of how alone he was out here. He tried to ignore his unease and focus on the task at hand. He needed to get to the wedding, and he was already running late. He was just about to start the car and drive away when he heard a tapping on the window. It was the woman, her face pressed up against the glass. James jumped in his seat, his heart racing. "Hey, can I get a ride back into town?" she asked. "My friend is going to come pick me up, but I don't want to wait out here all alone." James hesitated. He didn't want to leave her out here, but he also didn't want to get involved any further. He was just about to say no when he noticed something odd about the woman's reflection in the window. It wasn't quite right. Her face seemed to be melting. James rubbed his eyes, thinking he was seeing things, but when he looked again, it was even worse. Her eyes were black, empty holes, and her skin was starting to peel away from her face. James screamed and scrambled out of the car, backing away from the woman. That's when he noticed that her feet weren't quite touching the ground. She was floating a few inches off the pavement. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice echoing in James's head. James stumbled backwards, nearly falling to the ground. He was paralyzed with fear, unable to comprehend what was happening. He had heard stories of ghosts and spirits, but he had never believed in them until now. The woman floated closer to him, her ghostly form glowing in the moonlight. James felt a cold breeze pass through him, as if the woman's presence was sapping the warmth from his body. "You shouldn't have come here," she repeated, her voice now a menacing growl. "What do you want from me?" James managed to stammer out. The woman let out a bone-chilling laugh. "What do I want? I want revenge. And you, my dear, are going to help me get it." James felt a wave of terror wash over him. He had no idea what the woman was talking about, but he knew he didn't want to be a part of it. The woman floated closer to him, her eyes piercing into his soul. "You're going to help me find my boyfriend's grave, and then we're going to make his killer pay." James shook his head frantically. "I can't do that. I don't even know who you are or what happened." The woman's expression turned cold. "You will help me," she said, her voice laced with anger, "or I will make you suffer." With that, the woman disappeared into the darkness, leaving James alone in the cemetery. He stood there for what felt like hours, trying to collect his thoughts and make sense of what had just happened. Finally, he made his way back to his car, feeling more alone and terrified than ever before. He tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. He tried again and again, but the car was dead. James looked around, trying to find a way out of the cemetery, but all he could see were the rows of gravestones and the woman's ghostly figure hovering in the distance. He was trapped. As the night wore on, James tried to make himself comfortable in the car, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch, sent shivers down his spine. Finally, as the sun began to rise on the horizon, James heard a sound outside the car. It was the woman, and she was back. "Get out," she said, her voice colder than before. James tried to protest, but the woman was insistent. She led him through the cemetery, her ghostly form glowing brighter with each step. They finally arrived at a grave, and the woman pointed to a name etched in the stone. "That's him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's my boyfriend." James looked at the name, but he didn't recognize it. He tried to tell the woman that he couldn't help her, that he didn't know anything about her boyfriend's death, but she wouldn't listen. "You're going to help me," she said, her voice growing more urgent. "You're going to help me find the person who did this, and you're going to make them pay." James was shaking now, tears streaming down his face. He didn't want to be a part of this, but he knew he had no choice. The woman led him out of the cemetery, and they began to walk down the road. James had no idea where they were going or what he was supposed to do, but he knew he was in too deep. Finally, they arrived at a small house on the outskirts of town. The woman pointed to the window and told James to look inside. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. There, in the dimly lit room, was a man sitting in a chair. He was surrounded by candles and strange symbols, and James could see that he was performing some kind of ritual. The woman whispered in James' ear, "That's the man who killed my boyfriend. You need to make him pay." James felt his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to do or how to stop the woman from taking revenge. Suddenly, the man in the room turned his head and looked straight at James. He stood up and walked to the window, his eyes locked on James' terrified face. In a split second, the man's face twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing sharp teeth that glinted in the candlelight. James felt a wave of terror wash over him as he realized what was happening. The man wasn't just a killer, he was a demon, and he had been waiting for someone like James to bring him a fresh soul. The demon lunged at the window, breaking through the glass with ease. James tried to run, but he was frozen with fear. The demon grabbed James by the throat and lifted him into the air. James could feel his grip tightening, cutting off his air supply. As he gasped for breath, James heard the woman's voice in his ear one last time. "I told you that you would suffer." With that, James felt his life slipping away. The last thing he saw was the demon's twisted, snarling face as he was dragged into the darkness. Days later, James' car was found abandoned on the side of the road. His body was never recovered. As for the woman and the demon, they continued to haunt the cemetery and the small town nearby. Some say that if you're brave enough to venture into the cemetery at night, you can still hear their whispers and see their ghostly forms hovering in the distance. But after what happened to James, nobody was ever brave enough to find out for sure. It was a typical night in the quiet suburban neighborhood. The crickets chirped, and the streetlights cast a warm glow over the empty sidewalks. Mark was sitting in his living room, watching TV, when he heard a knock at the door. He got up to answer it and was surprised to see two children standing on his porch. They were young, around 6 or 7 years old, with dark hair and pale skin. But what stood out the most were their eyes. They were pitch black, like two bottomless pits. "Can we come in?" the children asked in unison, their voices eerily monotone. Mark hesitated, feeling a chill run down his spine. Something about these children made him feel uneasy, but he didn't want to be rude or alarm them, so he reluctantly invited them in. As soon as they stepped inside, Mark noticed a strange energy in the air. It was as if a darkness had descended upon his home. The children made their way to the living room and sat down on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. Mark tried to make small talk with them, but they were unresponsive. He offered them some snacks and drinks, but they declined. They seemed content to just sit there in silence, their black eyes fixed on the TV screen. Mark's unease grew with each passing moment. He felt as though he was in the presence of something otherworldly, something that shouldn't exist in his world. As he debated whether to ask the children to leave, he noticed something strange happening on the TV. The images flickered and distorted, and he could hear a faint whispering in the background. It was a language he didn't recognize, but it made his skin crawl. He turned to the children and realized they were no longer just sitting there. They were staring directly at him, their black eyes boring into his soul. "Can we go to your bedroom?" they asked in unison. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He didn't want these strange children anywhere near his bedroom, but something compelled him to agree, and he led them down the hall to his room. As soon as they stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. It was colder, and the air felt thick with malevolence. Mark could barely see the children in the darkness, but he could sense them moving around the room. Then, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. It was as if something was reaching inside him, trying to tear him apart from the inside out. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He fell to the ground, writhing in agony, as the children watched him with their black eyes. And then, everything went dark. Mark woke up the next morning, covered in sweat and shaking. He couldn't remember anything after leading the children to his bedroom. But he knew something terrible had happened to him. He tried to go about his day as usual, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he looked in a mirror, he saw a pair of black eyes staring back at him. Days turned into weeks, and Mark's life became a living nightmare. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. Everywhere he went, he felt the presence of those children, and he knew they were coming for him. One night, he heard a knock at the door. He knew it was them. He didn't want to answer, but he couldn't resist the pull. He opened the door and saw the children standing there, their black eyes gleaming in the darkness. "We're here to finish what we started," they said in unison. Mark knew he was doomed. He tried to run, but they were too fast. They caught him and dragged him into the darkness outside. As they walked, Mark could feel the ground beneath him grow cold and damp. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and he could hear the sound of rustling leaves and whispers in the distance. Finally, they arrived at a cemetery. It was old and overgrown, the tombstones covered in moss and vines. The children led Mark to a freshly dug grave, and he knew what was about to happen. They pushed him into the grave, and Mark felt the cold earth close in around him. He could hear the children laughing as they piled dirt on top of him, burying him alive. In his last moments, Mark realized the truth about the children. They weren't children at all. They were demons, sent to lure him to his death. And now, he was trapped in the darkness with them, forever. The story of Mark's demise spread quickly through the small town, and it wasn't long before people started reporting sightings of the black-eyed children. They would knock on doors, asking to be let in, and anyone who refused would suffer a terrible fate. No one knew where they came from or what they wanted, but everyone knew to stay away from them at all costs. Years went by, and the legend of the black-eyed children grew stronger. They became a cautionary tale, a warning to those who dared to invite the darkness in. But even in death, Mark couldn't escape their grasp. His spirit was trapped in the cemetery, forever tormented by the demons that had taken his life. And so, the black-eyed children continue to roam the earth, their true intentions unknown. But one thing is certain, if they come knocking on your door, don't let them in. Samantha had been dreading the anniversary of her mother's death for weeks. It had been 5 years since her mother had passed away, but the pain was still raw. She missed her mother terribly and wished that she could talk to her one last time. On the day of the anniversary, Samantha was sitting alone in her apartment, lost in thought. Suddenly, the phone rang, and she jumped in surprise. When she answered, the voice on the other end sent chills down her spine. "Hello, Samantha," the voice said. It was her mother's voice. Samantha was frozen in shock. Was this some kind of sick joke? But the voice on the other end sounded exactly like her mother. She could hear the familiar tone, the inflection, the way her mother would say her name. "Mom?" Samantha whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes, Samantha, it's me," the voice on the other end said. "I just wanted to talk to you, to let you know that I'm okay." Samantha's mind was racing. How was this possible? Was she dreaming? Was it some kind of hallucination? But as the conversation went on, Samantha started to notice something strange. Her mother wasn't talking about heaven or the afterlife. She wasn't even talking about herself. Instead, she was asking Samantha about her life, about her job, about her friends. And then, Samantha heard a noise in the background. It was a sound she recognized all too well, the sound of her mother's oxygen machine. "Mom, are you okay?" Samantha asked, her voice shaking. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. And then, a different voice spoke. "I'm sorry, Samantha," the voice said. "Your mother passed away last night." Samantha felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. But the voice on the other end of the line was calm, matter-of-fact. It was clear that whoever was calling her had been expecting this reaction. "Who are you?" Samantha asked, her voice shaking. There was another pause, and then the voice spoke again. "I'm a medium," she said. "I specialize in helping people communicate with their loved ones who have passed on." Samantha felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Was this woman for real? She had always been skeptical of psychics and mediums, but now she was starting to wonder. "What do you want from me?" Samantha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to let you know that your mother is at peace," the voice said. "She's in a better place now." Samantha didn't know what to say. She felt numb, like she was in a dream. But then, she heard the voice on the other end of the line again, and this time, it was different. It was colder, more menacing. "And I also wanted to let you know that she's not alone," the voice said. Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. What did that mean? Who was with her mother? But before she could ask, the line went dead. Samantha tried to shake it off. Maybe it had been a prank call, or maybe she was just imagining things. But then, she started hearing things. Strange noises in the apartment, footsteps in the hallway, whispers in the dark. And then, one night, Samantha woke up to find a figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was her mother, or at least, it looked like her mother. But her eyes were black, empty pits, and her skin was gray and mottled. The figure didn't say anything, it just stared at her with those black, empty eyes. Samantha was frozen in fear, unable to move or scream. She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare. Then, the figure started to move towards her, slowly and methodically. Samantha felt a cold dread wash over her. She knew that this was not her mother. It was something else, something malevolent. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. She tried to run, but her body wouldn't move. The figure was getting closer and closer, and Samantha knew that she was about to die. But then, the figure stopped. It cocked its head to one side, as if listening to something that Samantha couldn't hear. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. Samantha was left alone in her room, shaking and terrified. She knew that what she had seen was not a dream, but a real encounter with the supernatural. And she knew that she was not safe. In the days that followed, Samantha tried to make sense of what had happened. She spoke to friends, family, even a therapist. But no one could give her any answers. They all thought that she was imagining things, that her grief had made her paranoid. But Samantha knew the truth. She had received a call from beyond the grave, and it had opened a door that she couldn't close. She was being haunted by something that she couldn't understand, something that wanted to hurt her. And then, one night, Samantha heard a knock on her door. She looked through the peephole, and her heart stopped. There were two children standing outside, with black eyes that seemed to stare right through her. They looked innocent enough, but Samantha knew that they were not human. She tried to ignore them, but they kept knocking, insisting to be let in. Samantha felt a sickening dread wash over her. She knew that if she opened that door, she would be inviting something terrible into her life. But the knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. And then, Samantha heard a voice in her head. It was the voice of her mother, or at least, what she thought was her mother. "Let them in, Samantha," the voice said. "They're here to help you." Samantha knew that it wasn't her mother. It was something else, something that wanted her to open the door. But she couldn't resist. She felt like she was being pulled towards the door, like something was controlling her. And then, she opened the door. The two children walked inside, their black eyes fixed on her. Samantha felt a wave of fear wash over her. She knew that she had made a terrible mistake. And then, everything went black. When Samantha woke up, she was lying in a coffin, surrounded by darkness. She tried to scream, but her voice was gone. She tried to move, but her body was paralyzed. And then, she heard a voice in her head. It was the voice of the medium, the one who had called her all those weeks ago. "Welcome to the other side, Samantha," the voice said. "You're not alone anymore." Samantha realized that she had been tricked, that the medium had lured her into a trap. And now, she was trapped in the afterlife, with no hope of escape. She screamed and screamed, but no one answered. She was alone, surrounded by darkness and the sounds of the dead. And she knew that she would be there forever. Samantha tried to push against the sides of the coffin, but she couldn't move. She felt trapped and claustrophobic, and the darkness seemed to be closing in around her. She tried to think of a way out, a way to escape this nightmare. But her mind was foggy and confused, and she couldn't think straight. And then, she heard a scratching sound. It was coming from outside the coffin, from the lid. Samantha felt a surge of hope. Maybe someone was trying to rescue her. But as the scratching continued, Samantha realized that it wasn't someone trying to help her. It was something trying to get in. She felt a cold dread wash over her. She was trapped in a coffin with some unknown entity trying to break in. She tried to scream, but her voice was still gone. And then, the scratching stopped. Samantha held her breath, waiting for the next attack. But nothing happened. The coffin was silent. Samantha lay there, listening to the sound of her own breathing. She felt alone and abandoned, with no hope of escape. She knew that she was going to die in that coffin, alone and terrified. And then, she heard a voice in her head. It was the voice of the medium, the one who had trapped her there. "You're mine now, Samantha," the voice said. "You'll never escape." Samantha felt a surge of anger. She had been tricked and trapped, but she wasn't going to give up without a fight. She closed her eyes and focused all her energy on pushing against the sides of the coffin. She felt a sudden surge of strength, and the coffin shook. And then, with a loud snap, the coffin lid broke open. Samantha felt a rush of air and light as she was freed from her prison. She looked around, disoriented and confused. She was no longer in the coffin, but in a dark, cavernous room. She could hear the sound of water dripping and the rustling of unseen creatures. And then, she saw the medium. He was standing in front of her, a dark, shadowy figure with glowing eyes. "You can't escape, Samantha," the medium said. "You're mine forever." Samantha felt a surge of anger and determination. She wasn't going to let this thing control her life anymore. She reached out and grabbed the medium's arm, and with a sudden burst of energy, she pulled him towards her. And then, with all her strength, she pushed him towards the darkness. There was a sudden sound of rushing wind, and the medium disappeared into the darkness. Samantha felt a sense of relief and victory. She had defeated the entity that had trapped her. And then, she woke up. She was lying in her own bed, drenched in sweat. She looked around, confused and disoriented. She realized that it had all been a dream, a horrific nightmare that had felt all too real. She was safe, back in the world of the living. But as she lay there, trying to calm her racing heart, she couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't over. That there was something waiting for her, just beyond her reach. That was it for this video. See you next time.